Welcome to Westminster Presbyterian Theological Seminary's series of podcasts on church history. Arguably the most significant event in British church history and in wider Presbyterian church history was the Westminster Assembly held in London in the middle years of the 1640s. How the Westminster Assembly came about is interesting and intriguing. In 1638, the Scots had forged the National Covenant. This covenant was a rebellion, in essence, against the King, Charles I, and his intention to impose episcopacy on the Scottish Church. Archbishop Laud had insisted that the Anglican prayer book be read in the Scottish churches. This was the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. This was a bridge too far. And the Scots, who had been seething with resentment for the previous 30 to 40 years over kingly royal intrusion into the life of the church, decided enough was enough. And the National Covenant was forged by a number of significant noblemen and significant laymen, and very soon it seemed the whole nation was united in its opposition to prelacy, to episcopacy, to royal intrusion into the life of the church. This National Covenant set the church in Scotland on a collision course with Charles I. And this reached another climax in 1643 when the Scots allied themselves to the English Parliament in its controversy against Charles I. And the Solemn League Covenant bound the Scottish Church with the English Church and the English Parliament to establish, at least for a trial period, Presbyterianism throughout the British Isles. James I in 1603 had become the first monarch of a united kingdom. And the Scots were divine right Presbyterians, and they would not think of supporting the English Parliament against Charles I unless the Parliament was willing to support the Scottish understanding of polity in the church. So 1638, the National Covenant, 1643, the Solemn League Covenant, seemed to presage a day when a uniform church polity might cover the face of the British Isles. In that same year, 1643, the English Parliament summoned an assembly to meet at Westminster. Some of the men who had been invited to take part in the assembly, like James Usher, the Archbishop in Dublin, refused to come because it didn't have royal sanction. But in August 1643, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland appointed 8 commissioners to, quote, propone, consult, treat and conclude with the Assembly. 5 ministers and 3 ruling elders were sent south. They were non-voting members of the Assembly. Their allegiance was not to the Westminster Assembly, but to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. They were non-voting, but they had considerable de facto powers. They were something like an advisory committee. Robert Bailey, in his great and interesting, engaging and significant letters, wrote, "Nothing in any assembly that was in the world except Trent like to this in prolixity no people had so much need of a presbytery. But that was a Presbyterian's view of the assembly. Too much talking and not enough coherent, cohesive action. The assembly ran from 1643 effectively to late 1648, although it trundled along until 1652. But by 1648, the great documents of Westminster, the Confession of Faith, the larger and shorter catechisms, the Directory of Public Worship, and the treatise on church government had all been formulated. At the heart of the Westminster Confession itself was the biblical truth of covenant. Covenant became the organising or architectonic principle that shaped the Westminster Confession of Faith. Covenant theology was not novel to Westminster. A century earlier, Calvin in Book 2, chapters 9 through 11, sowed the seeds which were developed by Heinrich Bullinger and later Ursinus. And you actually can find the idea of covenant as an organising principle in a number of the early church fathers. James Walker, in his The Theology and Theologians of Scotland, said the old theology of Scotland might be emphatically described as covenant theology. This covenant theology has been the subject of much criticism subsequent to Westminster, in particular in the last 150 or so years. In more recent times, T.F. Torrance and his brother J.B. Torrance sought to expose the theology of the Westminster Confession as being un-Calvin and, more significantly, of course, unbiblical. But there's a number of things that can be said, actually, in refutation of their view. They didn't understand, I don't think, what the theology of the Westminster Confession actually was. Yes, it was inherently covenantal, but it was more significantly and profoundly Christocentric. You see, when we read the Westminster Confession of Faith, we mustn't read it ahistorically. It's a 17th century document, not a 16th or 21st century document. It's interesting to compare the Westminster Confession, for example, with the Scots Confession. For example, on the area of predestination, it would surprise many to realise or to discover that the Westminster Confession is far more moderate, nuanced, asymmetrical than the Scots Confession is on predestination. And it's also true that the Westminster Confession bears the hallmark of being a committee document. And in places, actually, that is obvious. So we must read the Westminster Confession within its historical context. Secondly, we need to understand that the theology of Westminster is deliberately and self-consciously ecumenical. In the words of B.B. Warfield, the confession reflects a generic Calvinism. The divines were not a monochrome body. We see this, for example, in George Gillespie's comments on God's decrees in the minutes of the assembly. The background is hypothetical universalism, the order of God's decrees. Bailey writes, unhappily, Amero's questions are brought in on our assembly. Many more love their fancies here than I did expect. It isn't a monochrome body. And while I think it's clear that the confession refuses to embrace hypothetical universalism, it still betrays an ecumenical dimension. Gillespie continues to discuss the order of God's decrees, and he writes in the minutes, let us not make our confession such that only a particular group can subscribe it. Let each man may make his own sense. Let us so frame the statement that each man can take his own sense. There was the recognition that there was a range of views in the assembly. In the third place, the confession's theology is self-consciously patristic, and you see that in chapter 2. A fourth significant feature of the confession is the inclusion of a chapter 12, on adoption. No other Reformed confession has this magnificent statement on adoption. And there are many other fine statements that the Church could well take to heart today, not least the fine statement in chapter 26, section 2, regarding the communion of the saints. It's interesting that the divines only reluctantly added proof texts to the confession. And probably the reason was that they didn't want a proof text mentality. Their vision was a biblical theological approach to the revelation of God in Holy Scripture. In our next podcast, we will continue to look somewhat at the documents that were prepared and that were subscribed by the divines at Westminster.